All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this hearing of the Budget and Finance Committee for Monday, January 26th, 2015. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chair of the Committee. I'm joined by my colleagues, Council Members Bob Blumenfield, Mitchell Englander, and Mike Bonin, and we are ready to proceed. We'll be taking general public comment at the beginning of the meeting, and then if anybody would like to fill out a card about any matter that you'd like to be heard on that's on the agenda, please go ahead and do that now and bring it forward, and we'll take those as we go. Members, I was going to propose items 4, 6, and 7 as consent candidates. I do have a card from Ms. Shahinian on number 4, but so members 4, 6, and 7, if there's no objection, items 4, 6, and 7 as consent? Yes. Okay. Yes. Oh, okay. All right, well, let's go ahead and make it items 4 and 6 then. Members will approve items 4 and 6 on consent without objection, and we'll have to hold item number 7. All right, so we're going to go next to our closed session items 1 and 2. I have no cards on items 1 and 2, so public comment on those matters is now closed. And if you'll all give us just a moment, we're going to consider items 1 and 2 in closed session.
Folks, all those not provided, step outside, please. For 1, did you remain? For 2, wait outside. Anything else?
About whether we should. Usually. That brings us to general public comment. I said we'd take that at the beginning, so we'll go first to general public comment. I have one general public comment card. That's from Mr. Previn. If you could come forward, Mr. Previn, please.
Okay, good afternoon. It is Eric Previn, a resident of Studio City, as well as a candidate for the Council District 2 seat. And today's public comment, I'm asking for the Budget and Finance Committee under Mr. Krikorian's leadership to step up and instruct their attorneys, the City Attorney of Los Angeles, to cure and correct, as I mentioned earlier, but I'd like to advance it. There's 30 days that are provided to do such a correction. An item appeared before this board on December 8th. It was item number 6, and it was a very interesting item that some of you were here for, some of you weren't. It was an item that made it possible so that in litigations that the city is battling, and it's a difficult process, as we all know, developers could be able, in this provision, to fund a panel of attorneys who are set aside to fight these city legal battles against, for example, community groups and residents. So it's been perceived in the community as a kind of second line of attack. And though it is very compelling because it is a way to not pay for litigation, it is, many of us feel, in a conflict of interest and lots of other things. But all that could come out in a proper vetting and discussion. Because it was improperly agendized, and I don't want to get into the weeds on it, on the date, but the City Attorney, Leela Kapoor, is aware of this, I think the appropriate way forward would be to instruct that group to give this the maximum ventilation, put it on an agenda here, and then also at the City Council where a large group could be heard, because there are a lot of community groups that are having difficulties with the interpretation of city laws. And, you know, Brown Act litigation is not real party litigation. On the day in question, 2 people came down to speak. One of them was heard, one of them was not heard. And it's my understanding, according to open government groups, if all of the people were not heard who wanted to be heard, you have to re-agendize it. So, again, this may get pushed through with your blessing through the proper channels, but I do think it needs a proper ventilation. So I would ask the council to take that action. Thank you.
Thank you. That was my only public comment card, so general public comment is now closed. Mr. Previn, sorry, I should have told you don't get up. That brings us to item number 3. You know what? I'm sorry. Let's hear the presentation first. So let's call item number 3, a presentation by the Mayor's Office on performance budgeting and fiscal year 2015-2016 budget process. Good afternoon.
We'll see how quickly we can get the technology running up again. Hey. Well, that's exciting. I think you guys have the presentation. Allegedly, this will start up. Yes,
And
that's it.
Is a copy of this available in the back?
I believe one copy is in the back. Hopefully, this comes up quickly.
Very good.
My name's Matt Crawford. I'm the mayor's budget director. Want to thank you guys for inviting us here to talk about our budget process for the 15-16 budget. This year is our second year of our transition into our performance budgeting, and this committee was an excellent help for us in our progress last year. We made a ton of progress really looking at a lot of data and information that we haven't been able to look at in the past. Departments did a ton of work providing that information to us and you, and I will say we were very, very appreciative of how well the committee took to our kind of new conversation around the budget, centering the budget around our priorities. As you can see from page 1 of the presentation, assuming this will actually come up at some point, everything our office, the Mayor's Office of Budget and Innovation, is driving to can really be summed up in one statement. It's a data-driven culture of innovation and excellence. And our performance budget process is just one part of it. You can see performance measurement, CompStat, open data, our innovation fund, which the committee helped us get going in this year's budget, and the council should be seeing some of those projects coming forward in the next month. These are all part of our overall efforts. Today, obviously, I'm just going to talk about the budget part of that. The first and foremost for us is the priority outcomes. Last year, we had 9. We've kind of rearranged them into 5. It's the same substance, but we think it's a little more focused and a little easier to tell what's going on. Matt Hale.
Who needs ITA when you have...
Matt Hale for the win. The priority outcomes, this is kind of the core statement that we're using to evaluate all of our budget proposals this year. The departments came to us with about 450 or so budget proposals, and each of them is laid out around how that proposal will accomplish our priority outcomes. The priority outcomes that we have, the way we've kind of laid it out, are make Los Angeles the best run big city in America, promote jobs for Angelenos all across the city, create a more livable and sustainable city, ensure our communities are the safest in the nation, and partner with residents and civic groups to build a greater city. I think you'll all notice that there's nothing revolutionary about any of these. There's nothing no one's going to look at these and say, no, that's not important. That's not what this is meant to be. It's not to be competition. It's really a value statement that should encompass everything the city should be doing. So the really simple way I've been framing it is, if you have a budget proposal and you can't fit it into these priority outcomes, we definitely shouldn't be doing that. So that's kind of our framework. This really helps us clarify our priorities and where we're going with things. It's our performance budget, focusing our available resources on the results that matter most. That's kind of really short one-line description of performance budgeting in specific. It's all about priorities. Why are we doing this? We discussed last year a lot of the need to change our conversation, to kind of rebalance the way we look at things, move away from just taking last year and adding a little bit here and subtracting a little bit there, and really starting to look at everything the city's doing, prioritizing it. The reason we have to do that is because once again this year we're facing a 9-digit shortfall coming into the year, as we have for every single year in my 15 years with the city. It's definitely our goal to get out of that situation because it's a hard way to do business. So we're trying to do that by prioritizing what we do, pulling back on the things that aren't so important and doing more of the things that are important. And because Angelinos expect and deserve results, again, around our main priority outcomes. How we do this in performance budgeting, we identify our goals, that's the priority outcomes and the goals within them. We develop options, that's what the departments have done in their 400 proposals. We prioritize those options, that's what we're getting into now with the CAO and our results teams and our budget team, working through and figuring out what's the most important things for us to do and what are the things that we don't need to do. Then we allocate resources, we figure out how much money we have, and we figure out which of those things should come first, and which should get more money and which should get less. And then, very importantly for us, we measure how we did. It's a very important part of performance budgeting. It's great to prioritize things, but where it really comes around full circle is after we fund those things and we hire those people and they get started doing the programs that we said we're going to fix the problems, we actually have to go back and measure if they fix the problems. If they fix the problems, then great, we can do more of those things. If it didn't fix the problem, we need to pull back, figure out another way to actually achieve those results. This is a calendar of our budget process for our full year. I think in the past, I know, we've looked at budgeting, the budget process as sometimes a 4-month process, sometimes a 6-month process. The reality is the city's budget is pretty much a 12-month process. It's just that there's really not time to just go back and do other things. This is a full-time effort to manage our $8 billion. It simply is a full-time job. We released our policy letter, as we do annually, in September. We met with a number of departments to talk about what they were going to propose, how they were going to do it, try and give them some more suggestions. We did that at the end of September through October. The departments turned in their budgets. Almost everyone turned in their budget on time. We have them all now, which is good, right before Thanksgiving. And that meant that my group in the mayor's office and the CAO have had between Thanksgiving and now to read them all and figure out what we have in front of us. Next, we have the results teams who are just getting started. I know we have representatives from a number of your offices helping us on those teams this year, as we did last year, and we're very appreciative of that. This is really our office trying to open up the black box of budgeting, where we've historically just kind of had the mayor's budget until April 20th and then hand it to you and you make of it what you will. We're trying to get away from that and really have a collaborative process through the whole thing. One way we can do that is by bringing your offices into our decision-making process so you can see how we're making decisions, so you can see why the decisions are being made, the trade-offs we're making. You can see how we've laid out the results teams. This year we have 4 groups. They're chaired by people with an absolute ton of city experience, a couple of which used to be budget directors, so I appreciate that. They got good perspective on my job. We also have representatives from the departments, 1 representative from the mayor's policy shop, and 2 council staff on each team. The results teams have one basic deliverable, and that's to take everything that was proposed to them and give us a recommendation as to how we should spend the money in that area. What programs should be funded, what programs shouldn't be funded. They'll present that to us at the beginning of March, and then we have through March to make all of our final decisions and hand over all those decisions to the CAO, hopefully by the first week of April, so they have time to actually print it up by the deadline of April 20th, at which time it'll be in your court. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we go right back to the beginning and we start again on the 16-17 budget. That's our process. I'm here to answer any questions about process. I can answer questions about, generally speaking, how we're approaching things this year. But I think the focus for today is really how we're going to get to April 20th, and how we're going to involve your committee and your staff in that process.
Can you speak to how in this process the mayor's budget day fits in and the input of the neighborhood council budget advocates?
We met with the advocates much earlier than we have in the past this year. I think we ended up actually meeting with them in August to talk about how they would be involved, because I think the advocates weren't really happy with the way they were involved in the prior year. They felt like they were involved too late in the process to really have an impact. And I think as we were looking at it with, meeting with them in March, I think they were right. It was very difficult to change what we had in place by the time we were really sitting down with them. So we met with them in August, and we'll be meeting with them again in February to talk about their white paper and what they're looking at in terms of recommending proposals to us and what they'd like to see in the budget. Along the lines of that, we will definitely be having a budget day. I don't know the date of that yet, but we'll be pulling that together to have the advocates talk about what they're looking at, talk about what they've heard from us, and we'll have a chance to talk about what we've heard from them.
Great. And you'll
But
also
the
bring
focus
mayor-
of that is making sure that we get that information early enough that we can actually do something with it.
And are you planning, once again, to do the mayor's online budget survey as well?
Yeah.
Great. Members? Mr. Blumenfield?
Sure. The performance aspect of the budgeting, how are you integrating the results teams and what they're talking about with, performance metrics and, what incentives are creating for better performance? And it's always a tricky dynamic, the value of a particular, budget item versus the efficiency of that item. Thank you very much. And I see the result, presumably some of that's happening in the results team, but if you could elaborate, that would be.
Sure. As we talked about last year, our shop, the budget shop, and our performance management unit are in the same group. We sit in the same office. I sit right next to these people. We work with them constantly. But budgeting and performance are, as you said, they're really two sides of the same thing. It's all just figuring out how to fund the things we want to do, and then measuring what we're doing. As it comes to involving the performance in the decision-making process, the departments are all required to provide all the metrics that we've been working with them to develop. A number of those metrics were things that your committee brought up in last year's process. So we should see a lot of your ideas of, hey, why don't you track this? Why aren't you looking at this? A lot of those things showed up, and a lot of those things will show up in the budget that we produce in April. So we'll be looking at those metrics. We also have been working very heavily with departments side by side and figuring out what the best way of measuring and evaluating a lot of their programs is, because as you guys know, some things are really easy to measure. Measuring cost per item on producing something is pretty easy. measuring how many miles of street we paved. It's pretty easy to measure how you're doing relative to a goal there. There are a lot of things the city does that do not lend themselves to those black and white numbers. And those are the type of things we've been really working with departments to figure out how can we really evaluate whether this program is actually meeting its goals. You can't just count, for example, the number of people showing up to a children's program or a youth program. You know, it's an interesting number to know, but if you want to know if it's valuable, you need to be looking at what the actual value to those youth is, what they're doing afterwards. Are those youth, you know, going and getting good jobs after that, or are they just going back to whatever it is they were doing with no real change? And that's a lot harder to measure, but it's something we're working on. And we have a few departments that have really taken that on as a challenge and are meeting it. So we're pretty happy with the progress there. I think I would be missing an opportunity if I didn't also say, though, this is going to be a long process in terms of really getting to a point where performance management and measuring our success is really inherent in everything we do. We're a long way from that, and it's going to take a while before I think we're really happy with it. But we're definitely making progress in that direction.
Are some of those metrics, where does the public see those metrics, and where do we see, as a council, see those metrics in this process?
We have, through our open data portals, we have a fair amount of that information available publicly through the performance.lacity and data.lacity sites. We will again be producing a significant set of metrics in the budget book that will be alongside the money that we're putting to those programs. So I think those are the top two areas that information is available publicly. And then through the process, with all the departmental submissions, all the metrics that they've produced at least exist. So we can definitely work through those and share that information as we go on through the process.
Because in terms of creating both incentives for departments and disincentives for bad performance, at some point in the process we need to have that linkage. Not again, and I'm with you. I completely understand what you're saying about it's got to be performance informed, not necessarily performance determined, because there's a lot of factors of values that go into the decision making, and I get that. But at the same time, for us to be effective, there has to be linkage too, so that and that has to be clear in some way. And I'm not sure exactly how we do that, but I certainly want to work collaboratively with all of you, and I know we all do on this committee to create that linkage, because it'll create not only better transparency but more efficiency.
I think we totally acknowledge that, and we share the challenge there in terms of figuring out how to do that.
Thank you. Mr. Kretz.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure that I'm totally sold on this process. And let me give you an example. I know in the budget process last year we were told that we do have some money that could now be used for alley repair rather than street repair. I know when we started discussing this with the department, and I can't tell you off the top of my head whether many of our alleys got repaired, but I'm not aware of many, so I'm assuming not, that it's less effective per square foot to repair alleys than it is to repair streets. And we have goals of X number of street lane miles. So if the department repaired a bunch of my alleys, even if it's the greatest need in my district in terms of street infrastructure, more than many streets and sidewalks and whatever, that's where the biggest hole is, so to speak. And an example of the worst, I actually had an alley that was more like a wading pool, had a pothole that was about 25 feet across and about a foot deep. it got resolved because a development went in nearby and they paid for it. But otherwise, probably never would have been actually done by the city. And the argument from the department is it doesn't help us meet our metrics. So from my point of view, the city is less successful in my district because it's got performance-based metrics. How do we deal with the metrics driving us to the degree that we might be less successful in some circumstances?
I think I would answer that in two ways. First, I think we need to acknowledge that things that we've pulled together historically are often not the same thing. Paving Wilshire Boulevard is not the same as paving an alley. They're just two separate things. They cost totally different amounts of money. The efficiency in terms of people and time is very different. So I think to that specific question, I would argue that we should actually split those two things out, fund them separately, and evaluate them separately. The other thing I would say to that is going back to Councilman Blumenfield's point, that really it needs to be data and performance informed, not data determined. We can't make decisions purely based on what shows up in a spreadsheet, because no matter how good the spreadsheet is, it's just not telling the whole story. So I think having the information is very valuable. Using it as your only source of information does a real disservice to the process.
And we may in this case have, as I recall, had a separate line item and separate funding, but there's only so much staff and priority to go around, so one could fund it and not necessarily have it implemented. The other concern is, I don't know where this fits in with our actually having a real dollar budget. But when I drilled down into why we have managed hiring and what the point is, it appears that we budget for more positions than we could actually pay for. So then we don't have a real budget to a complete degree, and then it's managed hiring that actually makes the final budget decisions. Is there any chance that performance budgeting will be connected with having a real budget with staff that can be fully paid for within the budget and actually be accurate?
That is definitely our goal, and actually it's really, really difficult to do good performance budgeting if you have that situation where you don't actually have enough money to hire the people, because then you're not going to be able to achieve the results that you said you were going to achieve. So acknowledging that there is a lot of that in the city, there are a lot of things after 7-8 years of cutting, which we've cut past realistic expectations, and departments are just making it work on a day-to-day basis where they don't have enough funding to actually do things the way they should be done. And those are things we're starting to be able to fix as we go into this year. But that is definitely, that's something as we move forward we are going to need to work on a lot, is just getting to a point where our budgeted resources and the results we say we're going to achieve with those resources actually line up.
You've only got 4 months left to do it till the next budget gets approved, roughly, but any chance eliminating managed hiring as part of that? Because the only purpose of managed hiring is to slow the hiring that we've paid for and budgeted, but then not do it.
At the risk of causing large-scale celebrations, I would say yes, there is a chance that managed hiring will be, getting rid of managed hiring will be part of that solution.
Sweet.
Well, you've got at least one vote out of 15 of confidence for that approach, and having an honest budget. I think it's made no sense that it's been sort of a secret that even took me several years to realize that we don't actually budget for what we can pay for. We over budget and then cut back. So if you actually can help us be presented with a real budget and without a need for managed hiring, whatever else you do in the process, I will applaud.
Mr. Englander.
I am 100% sold on this, and
We know.
first, let me, I know you know. This is not something we can do in a day. And in fact, as far as the staff and the mayor's team and our staff collectively have been working together, I'm shocked that you've done as much as you've done so far, knowing full well how much more there is to do. This will be an ongoing, changing, evolving program. And I've always been of the firm belief that you can't fix what you can't measure. How long were we doing, before we started incorporating performance-based budgeting and metrics, the old system, if I call it, how long was that in place, our former budget process?
I couldn't tell you when it started,
When the city started, I think.
but I've been here for 15 years.
It's a little draconian. And I used to explain this to neighborhood councils and others about the budget process. And from my view, from an incredibly simplistic perspective, if you will, talking to the person in the grocery store for 5 minutes, if you had to explain the entire budget process, and I've done that too, the elevator speech, if you will, of the budget process in the city of LA, it was this. It was that we would take last year's budget, and then we would figure out what's our deficit or our surplus. I've never really been around for a surplus, but what's our deficit? Oh, it's $250 million. And we would spend 6 weeks talking about that deficit, that $250 million, and every department that would come up would talk about the things that they were getting cut and they couldn't make up and the services that they were going to lose and what it's going to mean to staffing. And then we'd shift things around and basically pass what we considered a balanced budget. That's sort of what we did. We did a much deeper dive internally, of course, in talking about processes and policies as it related to all of those functions. But in a nutshell, that's sort of the budget process, and because those were the tools before us. It used to be, just a few years ago, that in the budget books, there was a page on every department that said workload indicators. And the reason that was taken out is because there was nothing to track. And so they'd carry the previous numbers forward every single year. So if it said how many cases were processed in this particular department, it would say, for example, 280 cases. And the next year, the same number, and the next year, the same number. And people started to ask, how is it that you have the exact same workload indicators? And they said, well, there's no real way to measure what we're doing. We haven't put a system in place, so it's guesswork. And so they eliminated that. When we learned collectively about performance-based initiatives and looking at metrics development and working collectively with peer groups and knowing full well how much energy and time it was going to take to get that off the ground, that's why I started saying I'm shocked with how much you've actually already developed. There is a tremendous amount of time outside and above of everything else that you guys are already doing. This has just been layered on top. And I want to thank you for bringing our staff in, particularly in working closely with them and putting them on the review panels as well. The peer review panels are critically important to make sure that those priorities are driven home. I think making informed decisions is something we haven't been able to do because the information didn't exist. This is a major paradigm shift in the way the city has ever functioned. And in fact, the budget is probably the most important thing we do because it controls everything that gets done or doesn't get done, whether it's public safety or tree trimming or street repair or sanitation, whatever it is, new programs, programs for seniors, fixing alleys, whatever those things are, it's budget driven. And so having a full analysis and doing a deep dive into the data, if it's accurate and transparent and shared with the public, it becomes better and better with time. And so not making data-driven decisions has been a huge mistake, I think, for the city. This takes us in an entirely new, different direction. I do and absolutely agree with the concerns that were shared by Mr. Kretz. This can't be decision-making based by data. This should be decision, or the data doesn't make the decision. It's data-informed decision-making. And so I think there's a major difference between the two. And so when we start looking at and doing, really peeling back layers and looking at creating efficiencies or looking at where programs are priorities in every single department and drilling down into seeing what the goals are based on the priorities and having measurements to see if we're reaching those is so important. I'm not so interested in how many potholes we repaired this year versus last year. That number, to me, means nothing. Because if it were 100% every year, it just means we have more potholes. The question is, how long does it take for us to get out there and repair them? How long do they stay in good repair before the first rain comes and washes them out? Then how long does it take to get out there and repair them again? How long does it take for somebody to call a council office or the mayor's office or 311 to get it reported? Is that a 2-week turnaround? Is it a 24-hour turnaround? How many cars are hitting that pothole before it's repaired? So those things are important. The number, to me, is insignificant. We've got a budget to the number. I get that. And so it's important in having all of the information. And so we can go through every department and start looking at quantitative, qualitative information as it relates to customer service. That's key. How long are we taking to respond to each other? So I think you guys are, quite frankly, you've taken on a major, what I would consider a fight, and it hasn't been. Working with the city family, the unions, personnel, the departments, the general public, neighborhood councils, the budget advocates, so many stakeholders that saw this from the beginning saying, what are we doing? And you're trying to make it work, and I think it's working well. It will take time. It's going to evolve. It's going to change. And I want to applaud you, your entire team, and the mayor's office. And I also want to throw out a big shout out to our chair of Budget and Finance for seeing the light on this and embracing it at the beginning, being there as an early adopter, because this wouldn't be possible, quite frankly, if our chair of the committee weren't fully on board and supportive and committing his own staff and their time to it as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I can still remember the inspiration that you brought to this process, because you were really one of the preachers of performance-based budgeting, and I think your passion about it really convinced a lot of people of the importance of moving in this direction. So thank you for your leadership on this as well. Mr. Bonin.
Thank you. I too have heard Mr. Englander's passion on the issue. I think right after I got elected, he took me to lunch and gave me his elevator pitch. I kept pressing that damn emergency call button because it was a long pitch. But his passion for it was real, and I believe in it very much. I believe in it very much. I share Mr. Koretz's concern. I don't think it's a problem with performance-based budgeting. I think it's a question of what are the questions you're asking. And I wanted to ask a little bit about that. Mr. Englander talked about measuring the number of potholes you fill is not a particularly helpful metric. And for the purpose of discussion, I actually want to talk about Department of Transportation, because it's what I know best. So I'm curious how we're developing the metrics for DOT. Salita Reynolds put out shortly after she took office a sort of a vision plan for the Department of Transportation. How closely do the budget metrics match the goals of that plan?
I think the calendar was not particularly helpful to us this year with the new management at DOT. We had a set of metrics for DOT that I think everybody kind of accepted but wasn't really excited about. And with the new management and the strategic plan coming in with a pretty significant change in focus, moving much more heavily towards safety as really a primary goal for the entire department. That's forced a kind of shift in the metrics we're collecting to really try and understand what are the goal level, not the high priority level metrics, but the kind of project and program level metrics that we should be looking at to be measuring our progress on safety. So that's a real work in progress. The department's still working on it. Our PMU, our performance management people are still working on developing that. Some of the DOT metrics are just the same things that we kind of know. It's how long is it taking to get through, if you have requests from neighborhoods, how long is it taking to respond to them? How long does it take to process applications? If you need a traffic study, how long does that take? A lot of this stuff is pretty standard day-to-day stuff, but as it really applies to the strategic plan, we're really at a point where we are actually having to create things on the fly, figuring out we're not measuring the right thing now. What should we be measuring?
Well,
how are we going to measure it?
That's kind of what I want to get to. During last year's budget, I suggested that a good way to go about determining the metrics for the various departments would be to use the intervening months between the approval of last year's budget and the start of this one to work with the different council policy committees and have a discussion in those policy committees, in the Public Works Committee, about what the right metrics should be for street services, in T Committee what the right metrics should be for transportation. I'd still like to have that conversation in T Committee,
That'd be valuable.
and I'd like to schedule it. Because some of those metrics you mentioned are how long it takes to do a study. That's an interesting internal metric. It's not particularly relevant to my constituents. They want to know how long does it take to get the stop sign installed,
right,
or get the left turn signal installed. Because Mr. Koretz asked about the alley being disincentivized by a metric. We could easily have a metric, and I think it was a previous one, that measured the success of the bicycle master plan by how many lane miles you do. Mm-hmm. And you could do the whole damn thing in a year with Sharrows, and it's not going to do anything for anybody. Whereas if you did a couple cycle tracks, you may have done significantly fewer miles, but you've done a lot to enhance public safety.
I think the bike lanes are an excellent example of kind of shifting the focus on the metrics, because the standard and the easiest thing to measure is just miles, but the real measure is how much they're being used, and are they, what are the actual impacts that you're seeing. And unfortunately, that's harder to do, and it's not information that we've had in the past, so we actually have to start collecting that on a go-forward basis and using that to guide us.
So I'll schedule something with T Committee and Ms.
Great.
Reynolds and figure out how to do it. Obviously, it'll inform next year's budget, or the year after's more than this, but it'll still help. I just want to make sure we get to a point as we develop this that we don't need to use the hearings in April and May to debate the metrics. We're debating whether or not we've funded the department's right to achieve the metrics.
And I think at a very basic level, too, as we have those discussions on the metrics, assuming those happen in the next couple months, we can definitely react just in terms of what information we're producing in the budget book. Mm-hmm. It'll impact the dollar decisions a little bit less because of timing, but just in terms of how we're talking about things and where the metric focus is, we can do that based on decisions through the end of March. So.
Okay. How are we measuring the impact of one department's metrics on the performance of another department? And let me give you the specific example I have in mind. Last year, we increased the number of lane miles that were being resurfaced, but we did not increase the money or the resources to DOT to restripe those lanes. So we have, sometimes several months before a street gets restriped. So we don't have a stop line or a crosswalk, and that's certainly an impediment to public safety. So how are we going to protect against that?
In terms of metrics, I think based on the way we present the budgets by department, it's hard to do that way. What we've done to try and mitigate that on just a process standpoint is based first on what we thought would be kind of the most obvious cases, and certainly pavement was one of them. We've pulled the departments together. We pulled them together in the fall and said, you know what, you need to work on your budget proposals together. Sit down, figure out how much you're actually going to do, in terms of output or goal, and then look at how much resources all of the involved departments need to do that, and then everybody come out with a request based on that. So like on pavement, there are about 4 departments directly involved in the pavement program between street services, DOT, engineering, and GSD. So all 4 of them came together, have said, okay, how many miles are we going to budget out? Okay, what resources are going to be required to do that? So that when we got our budget proposals from the departments, each department was proposing the same level of output and the amount of resources that would be required to actually do that. So now it becomes incumbent on us to actually fund it that way. But
Yeah, can I infer from that that our resurfacing and our restriping budgets will match up in the next year's proposed budget?
yes,
Okay, that's 2 pieces of good news in one afternoon.
pavement's just one example. We've really encouraged that multi-department budgeting across the board, and I think we ended up with 5 or 6 different different areas where at least 2 departments were sitting down and coordinating their proposals so that they'd be giving us 2 departments' proposal toward the same goal at the same level, so that it would be consistent.
Separate sort of track. In Mr. Krikorian's opening question, or in his opening questions, he asked about what have you been doing to reach out early to the neighborhood council budget advocates, and I appreciate your answer on that. Same question, but different group. What are we doing to reach out early to the city employee unions? Not so much on the contract issues, but every year during the budget process, they have a white paper, and what are we doing to engage with that early?
It's been a little less formal than our interactions with the advocates, but we've definitely been in conversations with the labor groups around what they're looking for in the budget, and really keeping them informed of how we're doing things in terms of our process, where we're going with things. We've also been really working with the labor really heavily to promote the Innovation Fund, to pull out all those ideas from all of the city employees.
Are we evaluating their savings proposals and stuff?
We have those set from last year. I don't, off the top of my head, I don't know that we've gotten a new set, but definitely over the years, the city employees have produced such an amazing volume of ideas, both how to save money and how to simply provide better service, that it's always a good idea for us every year to go back and revisit those things that might not have happened and figure out if there was a good reason why they didn't happen, and if there's not, is this the year that we should pursue that?
Thank you.
And just to follow up on that, the Innovation and Performance Commission has done outreach to every single city employee, inviting their input about ideas that will be cost-saving or efficiency-creating. They're doing a terrific job of evaluating the input that they've gotten from individual
We've gotten more than 300
employees.
proposals out of city employees.
It's fascinating. I went and visited with the commission, and it's fascinating to see that process that they're going through of evaluating the various ideas that are scalable and can actually realize long-term savings for the city. Yeah, Mr. Kretz.
A couple things on things that just got mentioned. One, striping. If we're actually making public safety a priority, that's one of the most dramatic and easy changes. So one would assume that once this is working, you'd see the street done, and later that day or the next day, it would be striped. I know I've talked to folks in that department when they've done work, and I've been told we don't have enough equipment and we don't have enough personnel. Can we start, assuming we're doing all the right stuff in this coming budget, can we start towards some of that before we actually hit the budget year, so that we can have a year of doing it right rather than a year of moving towards getting it right?
Our, through the Mayor's Office of City Services, meeting with all the different pavement preservation related departments, the equipment definitely came up. And we were able to work with GSD to start moving forward some of the large-scale equipment purchases for DOT, just because the stripers take so long to order. It's like a year-long process. So pulling that together in advance is necessary to actually see an impact, and we've been able to do that in a few specific cases. So that's definitely, as we go forward, if we see more things like that where it makes sense to, get those equipment pieces ordered in advance of July, we should definitely continue to look for those opportunities.
That's good. I'm glad to hear that, because I had that exact thought that obviously you need some time. So another example, we were talking about potholes and filling them, et cetera, et cetera. Probably the longest term example of that is the quality of our actual rebuilding of streets. As an example, for years, people asked on Wilshire and the stretch between the Comstock and the Beverly Hills border, which probably had somewhere between 500 and 1,000 potholes, that could fix. So we completely rebuilt that. And now, and that was great. People loved it. Now, as I drive on there, I see a few deep potholes already. It's only been a few years, and getting a rebuild like that is probably going to happen once every 25 years. But it's only been about 3 years, and you already see chunks taken out of it. That tells me no matter how much money we spend on rebuilding all of our streets, unless we find a way to do it with more permanence, we're not really getting anywhere. So perhaps that should be, ultimately, if we're looking at metrics, the place where we should look more aggressively. And I know our innovation committee, whatever we're calling it now, has taken a serious look at least one proposal to use more aerospace technology to see if a better mix can be made. But if we're going to use asphalt and not concrete, if that's the long-term solution, we can't continue to do it in such a way that a completely resurfaced, beautifully done street already is getting chunks taken out of it. That means if we're lucky, we'll have done half the city, even on an advanced, sped-up basis, and 5 or 10 years from now, we'll be seeing the same thing. So I hopefully before we actually take the big step, assuming we do, of doing a major billion-dollar-plus rehab of all our streets, we'll make sure we actually have the most up-to-date technology, and we're actually using materials that will last and make it worth investing those billions of dollars.
That longer-term perspective is really necessary as we kind of try and climb out of the fiscal hole and the hole in services that we've kind of fallen into over the last decade.
Okay, members, anything further on this? Terrific. Thank you very much for a terrific presentation. This is not an action item, but we do have two cards. We'll hear first from Mr. McQuiston and then Mr. Previn. Good afternoon.
Jim McQuiston, I hope you'll indulge me a little bit. An outsider can get more done on this than an insider. I remember when Cindy Misikowski found out that there was a $340 million deficit every year in garbage pickup. And outsiders got together and said, look, City Council, you can collect for garbage. And there was a lot of hesitation, but finally they did collect $340 million. And the CAO at the time said he'd been trying to get the City Council to do that for years and years. It was the outsiders that got that done, $340 million. I want to give you some more suggestions here, which I think we haven't talked about, and yet this is in line with what the mayor is trying to do. First of all, we got to obey the state government code regarding plans, community plans, general plans, and process. If we do that, we save about $20 million a year. Now, $20 million isn't a lot, but look, we could put a maybe 3 or 4 playgrounds for $20 million. That would cut down the police problem. That means we save lots of money just by obeying the state law. Another one, if we obey the state streets and highways code, we're supposed to charge people for fixing things, and we don't. We used to, and somehow we just got out of the practice 40 years ago. This is something that the state says you have to do, and we don't do it. Okay, there's another $20 million that I actually computed some time ago that we could save. Another one, if we obey the constitutional equal protection law, when we charge somebody for service, if you're a developer, you charge $5,000. If you're not a developer, you're charged $100. That's against the Constitution. We got to equalize those things. So when we get through with these things and go through that way, we divert what we're wasting, and we don't realize we're not getting that kind of results because we're not looking at the overall picture.
All right. Thank you very much. Next speaker is Eric Previn.
Yes, good morning. It is Eric Previn, a resident of Studio City and a candidate in the CD2 race. I found this very interesting, and I must say it was a nice report from the mayor's guy. And I think that performance-based, business is a great way to go. We should think of ways, and it seems like all of you are, that we can be tracking the right kinds of things. I think from the public's point of view, there is certainly the accountability piece. As an example, there's a small business in our district that was trying to get their permits going. It did take 11 months, so it was a frustration there, and I think that's a metric that's worth looking at. How can we improve the timing on that by consolidating some of the permitting processes? And then built right into that was a parking district idea that if you have a short number of spaces, if you're short what the allotment required by your square footage is, you pay a $100 penalty, and they do that. Businesses do this all the time. It goes into a fund. Here's a question of accountability. Where does that money go? Because the small businesses up and down the boulevard never see the parking structure that's coming. There's a frustration with being tagged but not getting the result of that. In terms of another great example is, of course, the 2020 report that we've been reading about in the newspaper that came out, made a lot of recommendations, and we promptly sort of stalled, I think is the term the newspaper used on that. So I think that, when we have good ideas that have been put out into the mix, we should chase them. There was a lot of talk about DOT today, and I don't know, I guess that's because it's one that we all deal with in your district. There's the question of the $165 million deficit is interesting because we also have $165 million in revenue that comes off of Parking Violations Bureau. Now, this is a group that you guys know has been farmed out to Xerox and PWRT, and they're very efficient guys. And so there's an example where they're doing 20 calls, I think it's in a minute, not 20 calls, but they're supposed to flip through 20 summons, call it hearing requests, in 1 minute. And they hit those kinds of metrics. Now, it does bring the city more money, but what it does is it hurts ordinary residents. We should know how many residents are contesting these citations and how many of them are prevailing. There's been some coverage of this story, but I think that there's a lot to do, and I'm glad that this body is asking questions and engaging. And I would recommend that we have public hearings on the budget because ordinary residents are absolutely excited about that.
Great, thank you. Don't go anywhere. Item 7, members, I had intended to recommend as consent, but we do have a card from Mr. Previn. So, Mr. Previn, if you can, just go right into number 7, and we'll take that one out of order. Well, actually, let's go ahead and call it item 7.
Correct me if I'm wrong,
Item number 7 is a motion, Wizard O'Farrell, relative to funding for the artwork design, fabrication, and installation project administration and long-term artwork maintenance at a new Los Angeles Department of Transportation bus maintenance CNG fueling facility at 500 East Commercial Street in downtown Los Angeles.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I noted that item, very interesting, and I love that we have a 1% art, I don't want to say tax because that's unfriendly, contribution that's made to the arts for the facility is my understanding, but this is written quite open. So is that, it was a $172 million job, if I have, a $17 million job, so it's $172,000 payment will go for art. So will that be deployed in the facility to, for example, commission some art, or is that money that can be used and applied to other city arts needs? That was sort of the question. I realize we don't often respond in this setting, but if someone knows the answer, I would like to know the answer. But I'm very pleased with the idea that projects do contribute to funding the arts. I think that's in our interest. And I would thank Mr. Krikorian for, of course, making there's an art contest coming up, and certainly the Department of Transportation is doing their part by putting up the prize will, I think, be some Department of Transportation exposure, which, as you know, can be quite lucrative because the dash buses in the city are quite well regarded, and I don't remember who does the business there, but somebody does the business. Thank you.
Thank you. Members, any questions or comments on item number 7? All right. If there's no objection, then it will be the action of the committee without objection to approve the recommendation on the motion. So, thank you. That brings us to item number 5.
Item number 5, the City Administrative Officer report relative to the use of hybrid and electric vehicles and the impact on gas tax revenue.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm David Harana with the Office of CAO. Last year during council deliberations, you asked for a report back on the impact of hybrid and electric vehicles on our gas tax revenue. Before you is a report from our office generally describing the impacts of hybrid and electric vehicles along with other impacts on the gas tax revenue. What's clear to us is that it's very difficult to isolate the impacts of hybrid and electric vehicles on the local gas tax revenue. There are a variety of different factors that come into play, and they tend to come into play together, sometimes in an offsetting manner. So we've included some information for you to read, and if you have any questions, I'm here to try and answer your questions. Otherwise, we just ask for your approval of the report, which recommends that the council note and file this information.
Okay. Members, questions?
Quick question. It shows the latest data is from 2008. Is that correct?
The report before you includes an attachment from the Federal Highway Administration that describes some of the difficulty in estimating the impact of electric vehicles, and that was done in 2008. But it still holds true. Are you asking for any particular data on gas tax revenue?
Actual data, yeah, the gas tax revenue, particular data on revenue.
Okay, on gas tax revenue for which year, sir? For the current year or the most recent year? What are you looking?
Yeah, most recent.
The most recently completed
Well,
year?
the current year would only be this month, but yeah, 2014 is latest, maybe 2013.
Okay. Fiscal year 2013-14, we had $122 million in actual revenue. This year and fiscal year 2014-15, we're tracking very close to that as well. It's down a couple million from that level, but still very high.
And those were, I'm sorry, then those were in the report?
They are not in the report, no.
So we do have that current data, though?
We do have some current data.
Can we include it in the report when it comes to council?
We could, yeah. I think what we're waiting for is the mid-year report to kind of firm up some of these projections and give you the best projection we can for this fiscal year.
I'm sorry, the what?
We're pretty much waiting for the mid-year report to give you the best projection we can on that. But we can try and include something for you for
Just
council.
something a little more recent than the 08 numbers that we have in the report.
Yeah, actually there are no real revenue numbers for the city of Los Angeles in here.
Right.
But we can definitely include some for you.
Okay.
I mean, it might be helpful, for example, just in really gross, just to say, take the last 5 years and see what the trend has been on gas tax revenues.
Yeah, that's very easy to do. The caution I would give you is you can look at the trend, but isolating a reason for it is extremely difficult. So
Sure.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Okay.
Many variables.
Never going to be.
Too many variables and too many of them offset.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and our impact, we don't control a lot of that, right? If we wanted to increase the gas tax, we really couldn't.
Yeah.
You couldn't increase the gas tax, and you don't really control any of the factors that are related to the gas tax.
Yeah, and I wasn't asking for that
Yeah.
reason, but right, no, it's a good point. We don't have that ability.
I mean, right, we don't have that, even if we wanted to do a vehicle miles traveled, we might have some legal issues. We tried to create our own tax structure, I mean, it has to be done at the state level, most likely.
Correct. I mean, there's some concern that structurally the gas tax would be a decline in revenue as fuel efficiency increases. And there's some discussion at the state and federal level in particular about how do we replace that and provide revenue to fix our infrastructure. And vehicle miles traveled is one way of doing it. However, right now you also have things like low gasoline prices playing into it, burgeoning population, and things like that that tend to play into gas tax revenues as well.
I don't remember, as I sit here, what the genesis of the request for this particular report was, but I think that the overall import of it is that we can expect that gas tax will not be an increasing source of revenue that the city can rely upon, but all the trends would probably be driving it down, whether it's fuel efficiency, fuel cost, the greater availability of active transportation and public transit. All of those sorts of factors are going to tend to make us less and less able to rely upon the gas tax as a
Fuel cost is
revenue
actually
source.
driving up,
Correct.
because as the fuel price
Correct.
goes down, more people drive, and since we get it based on, not on dollars, but on gallons.
Correct.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
this month.
This month,
But
yeah.
what I'm saying is, as the trends of
Yeah.
overall of costs go up,
Right.
we don't gain any benefit from that except that people drive less, and so that's
Which is
like
the
the
benefit.
trend that's likely to
Right.
continue. It's a benefit except for our revenues. So,
Correct.
all right. So if you could just bring back, like.
Councilmember, since this is recommended for note and file,
Yeah.
my understanding that this won't go to full council, but we could include revenue numbers in the next financial status report, which is due out in February.
Perfect. And then if you could just put a 5-year time frame on it. so
Sure,
that
we
see
could do
the
that.
trend line.
Sure, no problem.
Okay. Anything else on this? Members, questions? All right. So we're noting and filing this, right? Noting and filing this report.
Thank you.
Is there any other action before the committee? Seeing none, we are adjourned. Thank you all very much.